Second Nedarim Daf Samach and Samach Tes are two short dafim that will combine into one. They begin by ending the Gemara's discussion of the source for the halacha that a husband and father together have to be meifir a neder made by their daughter or wife. And Gemara is going to look for the source of that. We'll have one additional pshat to the source of that. We've already seen one. And then Gemara will get into a list of shaylas as to how these two hafaras work together in Lumdis, and then Gemara will try to answer them one by one, and that discussion will actually continue far into the next half. So let's begin. The Gemara has already said one source for the fact that a nara hama arasa, a girl who's not a Bulgaris yet, who is engaged, she has kedushin but not nesuin. In order for her neder to be mufar, it has to have the husband and the father both meifir together. So what's the source of that? So we've already seen one from the pasuk of im hayoy sia leish, and talking about Nedarim of the father. It then says, and then if she goes and gets engaged, she gets kedushin. So that's one source. And where says the second source is brought by Dibei Rabbi Shmuel, Tana Dibei Rabbi Shmuel. That's a brisa. It's learned out of the end of the parsha of Nedarim, where it says bein ish leishtoi, bein av lebitoi, and the Ran adds binureha beisavia. The Ran says the limud is from binureha beisavia. Neureha beisavia implies that we're talking about kiddushin. That's still beisavia, but it's neureha. And it says that it's bein ish leishtoi and bein av lebitoi together. That shows that you need to have the father and the husband acting together. Now the Gemara wants to know, what does each of these two sources do with the pasuk of the other one? So Gemara says, according to this Tana D'Rei Rishon, what do you do with the pasuk of im hayoy sia leish? So Gemara says that's for a different limud, which we will see on Daf Ayin, where Rava, over there it's Rabba, but here it says Rava, bring a limud that if actually the kedushin falls apart and the husband dies from the kedushin, she goes back to the rishos of the father exclusively for Nedarim. That you need a limud for, and that's not that of im hayoy sia leish. Says Gemara, according to the pshat, that im hayoy sia leish is to teach me that there is combined shlita for this hafaras nedarim. What do you do with the pasuk of bein ish leishtoi ubein of libitoi? Says the Gemara, that's to teach me that the husband can be meifir nedarim that are between him and her. That is a halacha that does not apply to the father. It's a machlokas that applies to the father, but according to this pshat, that it does not apply to the father. The father can only be meifir nedarim that are inoi nefesh. The husband can also be meifir nedarim that are inoi nefesh. But additionally, anything which is between him and her, that's personal to them in their marriage, he can be meifir. That's learned out of this pasuk of bein ish leishtoi bein av lebitoi. All right, now the Gemara starts with his shilas in Lumdis. So the Gemara says, what is the Lumdis when you have the husband and the father are sharing the rights to nedarim? How do they share it? Is it a sharing in eichos or is it in kamas? That is, each one has half. Quantitatively, that if one is meifir and the other is not, half the neder is completely off and the other half of the neder is completely on? Or is it in eichos, that is qualitatively, that if one is meifir, the neder gets weaker, the entire neder still exists, but it's weaker until the other one is meifir? What would be an example? So Mar gives an example of if she makes an isser to eat olives, let's say 2 olives, and one of the 2 is meifir, the husband or the father, one of the 2 is meifir. That means now she's allowed to eat one of the 2 olives, she's not allowed to eat the other one, or means she's not allowed to eat either of them, but the isser is downgraded from an isser that carries malchus to just a regular isser that doesn't carry malchus. So what would the nafkamina be? Let's say she goes ahead and she eats both olives. She eats both olives. She definitely violated the isser. The question is, if they share it quantitatively, that means that she ate 1 olive, that was a complete isser, and she should get malchus for it. If, however, they share it qualitatively, when one was meifir, it became dropped from an isser malchus to an isser without malchus, and she would not get malchus for eating that half. So the Gemara asks a shaila, and the Gemara brings a lengthy brisa in order to establish a raya. The Gemara is going to say it's actually machlokas beis Shammai and beis Hillel. Now the brisa that the Gemara is going to bring, it's actually a Mishnah. It's partially quoted in the Mishnah coming up in a few daf, and it talks about what happens if one of the parties never gets a chance to be meifir, mekayim, or react to the neder properly. Now let's just remind ourselves there are 3 potential reactions when a woman makes a neder. Whoever has the right to be meifir, let's say the husband, he can either be mekayim it, and he could say, yes, I'm mekayim it, in which case it's mekuyim, or he could just be silent and nothing happens, in which case it is mekuyim after the day in which he hears it ends, or he could be meifir, in which case it's canceled. Those are the 3 possible reactions. Now the Gemara says, what happens if the husband dies. So the Gemara says that here you have a difference between the husband and the father. If the husband dies and not properly react, he doesn't get a chance to react in any of these three ways, then it is up to the father to take over the husband's rights. It's what the Gemara calls it empties from the husband to the father. It pours from the husband to the father. The other way does not go. If the father doesn't get a chance to react, you don't say that the husband takes over the father's rights. The father's rights remain, and the husband can't do anything about it. What's a case? So the Gemara says, let's go through the options. She makes the neder. If the husband never hears about it, he dies before he ever hears about it. So the father takes over his rights, and he can be meifir or not, or decide to be mekayim it for the husband's half as well. If he hears about it, but there is no reaction, and he dies before the day is over, again, you don't know what he would have done had he got a chance to finish the day. And again, the father can take it over. Now, if he dies and he's meifir before he dies. So now the husband was meifir his half. The father can now go ahead and be meifir his half if he wants. However, if he dies and he is mekayim it, so now the husband was mekayim his half. The father can't do anything. He can't take over that half. That half stays mekayim. There's nothing he could do about it. The same thing is true if he doesn't react and the day ends before he dies. That is also a kiyum. Now, the opposite is not true. If the father dies and he didn't get a chance to react, or he didn't react fully and he died before he got a chance, or he was meifir, the husband cannot take over the father's right. Now, the Gemara repeats this a few ways, and the Ran has a lengthy explanation of what the chiddush is in each repetition of this. Now, the Gemara now says that Reb Nosson says that there's a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. If the father is taking over the husband's rights, does he have to re-meifir his half? Let's say the father is meifir, and the husband didn't get a chance to react. He dies, and now the father wants to take over the husband's rights and be meifir the husband's half. Does he have to go re-meifir his half again? So Beis Shammai says yes, he has to re-meifir his half again. Beis Hillel says no, you don't have to re-meifir his half again. It's fine the way it is. It remains. So it says the Gemara. The explanation is obvious that this is the pshat. According to Beis Shammai, he has to re-meifir. Why? Because the husband and the father share in eichos. They share the shlita over the entire neder, and each one, if their chelik is to make it weaker. So now that the husband had died, he never was meifir. He never took care of his chelik. The father takes it over. He has to redo his chelik because the entire neder still exists. It's just weakened. He has to re-meifir the entire thing. However, according to Beis Hillel, it's not the pshat. The husband has half bekamos, and let's say one of the two olives. So if the father was meifir his half, so it's meifir. It doesn't matter what happens with the husband. Then when he takes over the husband's half, he has to be meifir that half. Does not have to touch his own half, which is already taken care of. There's nothing else to do about that. So says Gemara, yes, correct. This is accepted. It is a machlokes in these between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and of course we'll go like Beis Hillel, and therefore it's bekamos and it's not beichos. Another the Gemara brings more shilas. Rava asked, let's say one of the two is mekim. He's mekayim the neder that the wife makes. Can he cancel that? Can he go to Chacham and say, I want to be shoel, look for a Pesach on that it was mekayim it? So the Gemara doesn't answer it, but the Gemara says that if he could be mekayim that, so that I understand, because with him being mekayim, it's kind of like making a neder. He himself is putting the existing neder into force. So you could, just like you could be shoel on a neder, you could shoel on a kiyum of his wife's neder or on his daughter's neder. However, what if he's meifir? Could he take off his safara? Could he take off a cancellation? That's a little bit less logical, but if you could be meifir a kiyum, now we could ask, could you be meifir? Could you be that if you could be shoel on a kiyum? Now we'll ask, could you be shoel on a hafara? So the Gemara brings it. Rabbi Yochanan said you could be shoel on a kiyum and you cannot be shoel on a hafara. All right, now the Gemara gets to his next question. Rabbah asks, let's say he says twice, I'm mekayim for you, I'm mekayim for you. Then he goes and he's shoel on the first kiyum. Does the second kiyum now take effect? So the Gemara says, I'll bring you a simple proof. Rav said earlier that if a person makes two nedarim that are the same, he says, I'll make a shvuah, I won't eat it, shvuah, I won't eat it. Then he just show on the first one, the second one takes effect. Even though the second one didn't have any effectiveness because there was nothing for it to take effect on while the first one existed. As soon as you take off the first one, the second one is hanging and waiting, and it takes effect as soon as the first one is over. All right, Rabba asks Shaila, now what if he says as follows? He says a strange reaction. He says, I'm a kayim for you, I made for you, and the kiyum doesn't work unless the hafara works. So he kind of gives her a mixed signal here. So what's the halacha to that? So Gemara wants to connect this to the machlokes between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yosi with somebody who makes an animal tmura. That is, he has a carbon ola and a carbon shlamim in front of him. He brings a third animal and he says, this animal is tmura, it's instead of the ola. He says first it's instead of the shlamim, it's instead of the ola. So which one is it, instead of the shlamim or instead of the ola? So Rabbi Meir says you always go with the first thing that he says. Tfos lashon rishon, it's instead of the ola, and therefore you could bring it as a carbon ola. Rabbi Yosi says you have to take the last thing into account as well, and therefore it depends what he meant. If he meant to change, you go with the last thing. If he meant that it should be two things together, then it's both an ola and a shlamim. You can't bring an animal that's an ola and a shlamim. You have to sell it and use half the money to buy a carbon ola, and the other half of the money to buy a carbon shlamim. So it says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yosi, you obviously have to take his entire statement into account, and at the end he said there's no kiyum unless there's hafara, which means the bottom line you have a hafara, and therefore this ends up being mufar. Says even according to Rabbi Meir, that he would go with the first thing he said and say it's mekuyim, here not, because he added in the kiyum doesn't work without the hafara, which clearly means that his first thing that he said does not stand independently. And therefore even Rabbi Meir would agree here that the first thing that he said does not stand independently at all. Now, the Gemara asks, we have another shaila. Rabba says, what if he says that it's kiyum umufar to you? He doesn't say kiyum to you, mufar to you. He says the two together. So now what? Did he mean them to each function separately? Did he mean them to each work together? So Gemara says this is not a question. We know that Rabba says anything which can't work separately can't work together either. And he's referring to a situation where someone makes two animals meiser behema. He says this is the 10th and this is the 10th. Those two animals can't both be the 10th. It's not chal on both of them. And therefore we say if he takes two animals at once and he says both of you are the 10th, that also doesn't work, because since he can't do it separately, you can't do it together. So here also, since he cannot do the two different things separately, like we just said in the previous shaila, also he can't do them together. That's our psak here.